Hello to all the curious and thoughtful minds out there. Welcome back to FactUp, where thinking is alive, and we explore everything from a fresh and different perspective. Today, we're diving into a question that might seem simple at first glance, but the more we think about it, the more we realize it's one of the most fundamental and thought-provoking questions we can ask. We live in a world where science and technology advance every day. Things that were once mysteries now have clear definitions and established rules. Physics, biology, psychology, and even linguistics were once part of a larger domain, but over time they found their own paths and became independent fields. But this process of separation raises an important question. If all these sciences emerged from one original source, what was that source? And if everything has branched off from it, does it still exist, or is only its name left behind? Imagine a time when all human knowledge existed within a single massive tree. Over the centuries, its branches grew in different directions, eventually becoming separate trees of their own. But now that each branch has found its own way, what remains of the original trunk? Is it still standing strong, or has it lost so many branches that it has become nothing more than forgotten roots buried in the soil? Perhaps this is the fate of philosophy. Or maybe not. Maybe philosophy is going through the opposite process. Maybe it's becoming purer, stripped of everything that isn't essential. Maybe what we call philosophy today is just now coming closer to its true meaning. But is that really the case? Today, we're going to explore this question from its very foundations. Will philosophy eventually disappear, or is it, in fact, evolving toward its most authentic form? Let's begin this journey of thought together. Philosophy has always been the starting point of human knowledge and thought. The moment humans stopped accepting ready-made answers and began questioning, philosophy was born. Questions about existence, truth, consciousness, ethics, and the laws governing the universe all originated from philosophy. But over the centuries, these questions branched out, each becoming an independent field of science. In ancient Greece, physics and metaphysics were not yet separate. Thinkers like Thales and Anaximenes debated the fundamental substance of the universe, what we now call physics. Aristotle spoke about the soul and the workings of the mind, which later laid the foundation for psychology. Plato wrote about the structure of language and semantics, now a part of linguistics. Even disciplines such as economics and politics, now highly specialized, were once under the domain of philosophy. This process of separating sciences from philosophy is natural, but does it mean that philosophy is fading away, or is it in fact being refined, distilled, and moving toward its purest essence? Philosophy, the mother of sciences, or a framework for thought. 1. Philosophy as the mother of sciences. Looking back at history, we see that all modern sciences, from mathematics to biology, were once part of philosophy. In medieval universities, what we now call science was referred to as natural philosophy. However, with the development of empirical and experimental methods, these sciences gained independence. Newton, often regarded as the father of modern physics, titled his famous work Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, which later evolved into classical physics. Freud and Jung, the pioneers of psychology, were originally philosophers. This natural process has led to two contrasting views on philosophy. The view that philosophy is shrinking and losing relevance. As sciences branch off, philosophy has less and less to study. What is now called philosophy is more like subjective interpretations rather than concrete knowledge. Science has taken over many questions that philosophy once explored, leaving little room for its relevance. The view that philosophy is being refined and becoming purer. Philosophy has always been at the forefront of knowledge and is now focusing on more fundamental questions. Empirical sciences answer specific questions, but philosophy addresses foundational issues. Philosophy is not about reaching final conclusions. It is about the process of thinking across all domains. But what do great philosophers say about this transformation? Is philosophy truly fading, or is there something deeper at play? Philosophers' perspectives on the evolution of philosophy. Aristotle, philosophy as the foundation of knowledge. Aristotle divided knowledge into two main categories: theoretical sciences, including mathematics, physics, and metaphysics; practical sciences, including ethics, politics, and economics. He believed that specialized sciences might emerge from philosophy, but metaphysics would always remain at its core, as it deals with questions that science can never fully answer. Kant, philosophy as the framework for understanding science. Immanuel Kant argued that philosophy is not disappearing, rather, it is the foundation of human cognition. In his famous work, Critique of Pure Reason, he explains that science without philosophy is like a machine without guidance. He writes, "Science without philosophy is blind, and philosophy without science is empty." Kant showed that philosophy provides the framework for analyzing and interpreting all sciences, rather than being just another academic discipline. Hegel, philosophy, is in constant evolution. Hegel introduced the concept of dialectics, which suggests that every idea evolves over time. According to him, sciences may separate from philosophy, but philosophy itself also transforms and uncovers new issues. He states, "The progress of philosophy is the progress of human self-awareness." This means that every time a branch of philosophy becomes a science, philosophy itself advances to a new level of understanding. Heidegger, philosophy as the return to the foundations of existence. Martin Heidegger viewed philosophy not as an academic subject, but as a way of thinking. He believed that as sciences became more specialized, humanity moved further away from fundamental existential questions. In Being and Time, he emphasizes that only philosophy can help us grasp the concept of being. He states, "Science can explain things, but only philosophy can question the nature of science itself." Philosophy should not be seen as a river losing strength as its branches diverge. Instead, it should be viewed as a flow that ultimately reaches an ocean broader, deeper, and more complex than any of the streams that have branched off from it. Each scientific discipline that has separated from philosophy is like a tributary that finds its way to the sea. But does this mean that the original river has dried up, or is philosophy now approaching its true nature? Conclusion of Part 1. Is philosophy disappearing? Philosophy once encompassed all sciences, but today it no longer deals with specific scientific matters. Some argue that philosophy has lost its function, but great thinkers like Kant, Hegel, and Heidegger have demonstrated that philosophy remains the foundation of human thought. Perhaps philosophy was once the mother of all knowledge, but now it has been refined, purified, and directed toward concepts that no scientific field can fully analyze. In the next section, we will address the question, if all sciences separate from philosophy, what remains of it? Does philosophy still hold meaning? Part 2. If all sciences separate from philosophy, what remains? Imagine that one by one, all branches of science separate from philosophy. Physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, sociology, linguistics, and even logic find their own independent paths. If everything has branched off, what remains of philosophy? Does philosophy have nothing left to study? Or on the contrary, does what remains represent its purest and deepest form? Perhaps philosophy, once stripped of everything else, becomes more refined than ever. But what is this essence? 1. Questions that cannot be separated from philosophy. Some questions can be transferred from philosophy to independent sciences. However, certain questions remain within philosophy because they are inherently unanswerable in absolute terms. These questions, according to some philosophers, form what can be called pure philosophy. Questions about what and why, not how. Science explains how things work, but it does not answer why they exist at all. Science explains how the universe formed, but it does not ask why there is something rather than nothing. Biology studies how life emerged, but it does not determine whether life has a purpose. Neuroscience studies the brain, but it does not fully explain what consciousness is. The problem of ethics and values. Ethics remains an area where science cannot provide definitive answers. Science can describe human behavior, but it cannot determine what should be considered right or wrong. Technology can give us tools, but should we use them without limitation? Justice, human rights, and the definition of good and evil all remain within philosophy. What is truth? Science operates within a framework of truth, but what is truth itself? Is truth only what we can observe and measure, or does it extend beyond experience? Is reality only what physics describes, or can it include dimensions beyond scientific measurement? Can the human mind grasp reality as it is, or are we only perceiving a limited representation of it? These are questions that will always belong to philosophy because because science alone cannot resolve them. Philosophers' views on the survival of philosophy. Philosophy as the critique of values. Friedrich Nietzsche believed that philosophy was not about discovering truth, but about examining and deconstructing the values created by humanity. We seek power. Truth is merely an interpretation. For Nietzsche, science may explain the world, but it cannot determine what is valuable. This is where philosophy remains. Wittgenstein, the limits of language and philosophy. Ludwig Wittgenstein argued that many philosophical problems arise from the limitations of language. He suggested that some philosophical questions cannot be answered through science because human language itself is inadequate for fully capturing reality. The limits of my language mean the limits of my world. He believed that philosophy should analyze language and the formation of concepts, something that science can never replace. Jean-Paul Sartre, Philosophy and Free Will. Sartre explored the issue of freedom and human agency. He argued that science might explain the laws of nature, but it cannot address human freedom. We are condemned to be free. For him, questions about free will and human responsibility will always belong to philosophy. Thomas Kuhn, Science cannot transcend itself. Thomas Kuhn, who introduced the concept of paradigm shifts in science, showed that even science itself cannot fully understand its own foundations without philosophy. No science can analyze itself. That is the role of philosophy. He explained that even scientific progress depends on philosophical thought, as the frameworks of science constantly evolve. Philosophy, the core of thought, not just an academic discipline. Since science cannot answer certain fundamental questions, philosophy is no longer just a field of study. It is a method of thinking. Philosophy as metaphilosophy. Perhaps in the future, philosophy will not exist as an isolated discipline, but as a way of thinking across all fields. Every science needs philosophy to examine its foundations. Philosophy as the critique of science. Science cannot question its own assumptions without philosophy. Questions such as, can science explain everything? Or, is scientific progress always beneficial? Are entirely philosophical. Philosophy as the bridge between science and meaning. In a world where information grows exponentially, philosophy prevents us from drowning in raw data and helps us extract meaning from knowledge. Conclusion of Part 2. Does philosophy still matter? Even if all sciences separate from philosophy, certain questions remain inherently philosophical and cannot be resolved by science. Nietzsche, Wittgenstein, Sartre, and Kuhn all demonstrated that philosophy is not just another academic discipline, but a way of thinking that allows us to understand science, ethics, truth, and ourselves. Philosophy is no longer just a field of study. It has become the framework for thinking about everything. In the next section, we will explore whether philosophy is merely a science of unanswerable questions or a method that compels us to think more deeply. Part 3. Philosophy is not the science of unanswered questions. It is the art of asking them. 1. Is philosophy just a collection of unanswered questions? Some people think philosophy is just a list of questions without answers, but that's an oversimplification. Philosophy doesn't just ask questions that science can't answer. It teaches us how to ask. Every time philosophy raises a question, science or society eventually finds a way to respond. But what makes philosophy unique is that its questions never end. Science seeks results. Philosophy seeks understanding. Science asks, how does this work? Philosophy asks, why does this work? Science says, this is what we know. Philosophy asks, how do we know it's true? Science gives answers based on observation and experimentation. Philosophy asks, can observation always lead to truth? Philosophy isn't about ignorance, it's about thinking correctly. What do philosophers say about the role of questioning? Plato, philosophy is a journey toward true knowledge. Plato believed most people live in darkness, like prisoners in a cave who see only shadows. Philosophy is what pulls us out of the cave and forces us to see reality. Truth is only understood through philosophy, not by accepting what is given to us. Philosophy is not just about gathering knowledge, it's about recognizing what is truly worth knowing. Descartes, doubt, therefore you exist. René Descartes argued that philosophy must be the foundation of all thought. By doubting everything, he arrived at the conclusion that the only thing he could not doubt was the act of thinking itself. That's when he wrote his famous line, I think, therefore I am. This redefined philosophy. It's not just about abstract ideas, it's about asking the right questions and seeking truth from the ground up. Karl Popper, science is nothing without philosophy. Popper believed philosophy was not just abstract thinking, it was the foundation of science itself. He argued that without philosophy, science would have no framework for testing and refining its ideas. Science learns from its mistakes, but it is philosophy that allows it to learn. He saw science as something that could not grow without continuous philosophical questioning. Michel Foucault, philosophy is resistance to power. Foucault viewed philosophy as a tool to challenge power structures and dominant ideas. Philosophy is the art of restlessness, the art of re-examining what everyone assumes to be obvious. For him, philosophy was not just about truth, but about who controls truth. Alain Badiou, philosophy holds politics, art, and science together. Badiou argued that philosophy could not be confined to a single discipline. It must move between politics, art, and science. Philosophy is not just a subject taught in universities. It is a necessity that flows through everyday life. Without philosophy, we cannot understand what science means, what art expresses, or what politics truly does. Is philosophy just a thought experiment or a necessity? Some people think philosophy is just an intellectual game. But in reality, philosophy is what teaches us how to think about the world. Without philosophy, how would we talk about justice? Without philosophy, how would we even know there is such a thing as truth? Without philosophy, how would science understand where its own laws come from? Philosophy isn't just about answers, it frees the mind. Philosophy is a path, not a destination. Philosophy isn't something you learn, finish, and move on from. It's a process, a way of thinking, a way of seeing the world. Philosophy is where science stops. Science can tell us how time works, but it can't tell us what time actually is. Science explains the brain, but it doesn't explain consciousness. Science studies the universe, but it doesn't tell us why the universe exists. Science tells us how things work, but philosophy asks, why should they work at all? Only philosophy can explore these questions. Philosophy is where we decide what matters. In a world where everything is constantly changing, the one thing that remains is our need for philosophical thinking. Is technological progress always good? Is freedom more important than security? Is justice always the same as the law? Philosophy keeps these questions alive. Does philosophy still matter? Philosophy isn't just about unanswered questions. It's about how we ask questions. Thinkers like Plato, Descartes, Popper, Foucault, and Badiou have shown that philosophy isn't disappearing. It influences everything. Philosophy opens the mind, drives science forward, analyzes politics, and forces us to keep questioning. In the next section, we will explore whether philosophy is disappearing or if it is evolving into something deeper and more essential. Part 4. Philosophy in the future. Pure or invisible? 1. Will philosophy disappear one day? Some believe that as science and technology advance, philosophy will gradually become irrelevant. If science has answered so many questions that were once philosophical, does philosophy still have a place? But maybe philosophy is not disappearing, it is transforming. Maybe instead of remaining a separate field, it will become something that permeates all aspects of knowledge and life, like an invisible thread connecting everything. Philosophy was once the mother of all sciences. But now that sciences have found their own paths, philosophy might not be fading away. It might be evolving into something deeper. Can philosophy ever end? Some think that if science eventually answers all our questions, there will be no need for philosophy. But this idea has two fundamental flaws. Does the end of philosophy mean the end of questions? Philosophy is above all a way of questioning. Even if every question we ask today gets answered, new questions will always emerge. If science one day explains everything, who decides what those explanations mean? If artificial intelligence takes over all decisions, who decides how those systems should be designed? If the universe is fully understood, does that mean thinking stops, or does it lead to new kinds of questions? The end of philosophy would mean the end of questioning, and as long as we question, philosophy will exist. Can artificial intelligence replace philosophy? With the rise of AI, many believe machines can take over philosophical thought. But philosophical thinking is more than just processing information. AI can analyze data, but can it reflect on itself? AI can identify patterns, but can it grasp concepts like truth, freedom, or justice? Computers can provide answers, but can they ask real questions? Philosophy is not just about analyzing facts, it is about interpreting meaning. 3 possible futures for philosophy. Philosophy could take different paths in the future. Philosophy remains an independent discipline. In this scenario, philosophy continues to exist as a separate field, but its role shifts. Instead of analyzing scientific topics, it focuses more on metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Philosophy merges with other fields. Here, philosophy ceases to exist as an isolated discipline and instead becomes a way of thinking embedded in all sciences. Each field would develop its own branch of philosophy: philosophy of science to interpret scientific progress, philosophy of technology to assess the impact of technology on society, philosophy of politics to examine the foundations of governance and values. Rather than disappearing, philosophy could become invisible yet ever-present. Philosophy transforms into something new. Perhaps philosophy will not remain an academic discipline or simply blend into other sciences. Instead, it might evolve into a new system of understanding reality. Could philosophy become an entirely new way of thinking? Could it develop into something that doesn't yet have a name? Just as science emerged from philosophy, could philosophy give birth to something new? Philosophy in the future might not look like what we know today, but as long as thought exists, philosophy will continue in some form. The unchanging need for meaning. Humans do not only seek knowledge, they seek meaning. Science can explain how the brain works, but it cannot tell us why thinking matters. Technology can build machines that make better decisions than humans, but it cannot decide whether machines should make those decisions at all. Politics can create social structures, but it cannot tell us what true justice is. Philosophy fills these gaps. No matter how much knowledge advances, the need for meaning will never disappear. Conclusion of Part 4. Is philosophy fading away? Philosophy may no longer look the way it did in the past, but it is not disappearing. It is evolving. Even if science answers many questions, philosophical questions will always remain. Philosophy might merge into other disciplines, but its way of thinking will continue to shape knowledge, ethics, and human decisions. In the next section, we will explore how philosophy, as a new way of thinking, could shape the future of thought itself. Part 5. Philosophy as a way of thinking, not just a field of study. 1. Has philosophy shifted from a field of study to a way of thinking? Philosophy once encompassed all human knowledge. But today, unlike physics, biology, or psychology, it is no longer an independent discipline with fixed rules. Philosophy cannot be learned and mastered like a science. It flows through the way we think. You don't need to be a philosopher to think philosophically. You don't have to study philosophy in a university to apply it in life. Every time you question the truth of an idea, the meaning of a concept, or the reason behind something, you are thinking philosophically. Philosophy may no longer be an academic discipline in the traditional sense, but philosophical thinking is present in every decision, every science, and everyday life. How does philosophy exist in all sciences and life? Philosophy guides science. Science provides empirical results, but it cannot explain the meaning or purpose behind them. Physics discovers the laws of the universe, but philosophy asks, do these laws truly exist, or are they just constructs of our minds? Biology explains how life evolved, but philosophy asks, does life have any inherent meaning? Medicine treats diseases, but philosophy asks, should we cure all diseases? Should we always extend life? Philosophy protects thought from bias and absolutism. Without philosophy, anything that appears scientific could be accepted as absolute truth. But philosophy teaches us that no knowledge is beyond questioning. No truth is final. Everything is subject to revision. Without philosophy, thinking turns into dogma. Philosophy shapes ethics and politics. Is democracy truly the best form of government? Should freedom of speech be absolute? Is technological progress always a good thing? Science has no answers to these questions, yet philosophy continues to define and redefine them. Is philosophy lagging behind science, or is it ahead? Some believe philosophy is always a step behind science, merely analyzing discoveries after they happen. But if we look closely, philosophy has often been ahead of science. Philosophy asks questions that later become science. When ancient Greek philosophers debated the fundamental substance of the universe, physics did not yet exist. When Descartes discussed the mind-body problem, psychology had not yet been established. When Nietzsche explored the role of language in shaping truth, cognitive linguistics had not yet emerged. Philosophy is always ahead because philosophy expands the boundaries of knowledge. Science seeks certainty, while philosophy seeks possibilities. Science tells us how things work, but philosophy asks us to think about things that don't yet exist. Science asks, what is true? While philosophy asks, could truth be something entirely different? Philosophy is the only field that allows us to go beyond science and imagine what has not yet been discovered. Is philosophy the science of the future, or something beyond science? Some argue that philosophy will always lag behind science, but others believe it is the only field that can go beyond science and direct future discoveries. Philosophy as the foundation for future knowledge. Perhaps in the future, philosophy will lead to scientific fields we cannot yet imagine. Could the philosophy of consciousness lead to a new science of the mind? Could metaphysics open new ways of understanding space and time? Could philosophy push science toward not just discoveries, but a deeper understanding of reality and awareness? Philosophy is more than science. Science gives us tools, but philosophy teaches us how to use them. Science can take us to space, but philosophy asks, why should we go? Science can extend human life, but philosophy asks, is a longer life always better? Science can create artificial intelligence, but philosophy asks, should machines have rights equal to humans? Philosophy is the only discipline that can lead us to questions beyond science. Conclusion of Part 5, is philosophy the future of thinking? Philosophy may no longer be a science in the traditional sense, but philosophical thinking exists in all areas of knowledge and life. Philosophy is not lagging behind science. It is always ahead, raising questions that later shape scientific progress. Philosophy is the only field that can prevent science from becoming rigid and absolute, guiding it toward a more open and complex future. In the next section, we will explore how philosophy can shape the future of thinking, not just in science, but in all aspects of human life. Part 6. Philosophy as the path to the future of thought. 1. Can philosophy shape the future of thinking? Philosophy has always been at the heart of intellectual transformation. Every major shift in human thought, from ancient Greece to the Middle Ages, from the Enlightenment to modernity, was driven by philosophy. But today, in an age dominated by science, technology, and data, does philosophy still have a role in shaping the future? The answer is simple. Without philosophy, thinking would cease to exist. Number 2. How does philosophy define the future of thought? Science has always been inspired by philosophy. Some of the greatest scientific breakthroughs began as philosophical inquiries. Before quantum physics existed, philosophers debated uncertainty and the nature of reality. Before the theory of evolution was formalized, philosophers speculated about change in living beings. Before artificial intelligence became real, philosophers questioned the nature of consciousness and intelligence. Even today, philosophical questions drive scientific progress. Is reality a simulation? Are the laws of nature absolute, or can they change? Can consciousness exist outside the physical brain? These are not just scientific questions, they are philosophical ones that push science forward. Should artificial intelligence have rights? Can machines achieve true decision-making and free will? Can ethics be programmed into code? Technology without philosophy is dangerous. If scientific progress moves forward without deep reflection on its consequences, we may arrive at a future that is neither ethical nor human. Philosophy forces us to ask, should we do this, instead of just, can we do this? 2.3. Philosophy and the future of politics and society. Should democracy be redefined? Should human rights be universal or relative? Should governments have control over private lives? Politics and society without philosophy become blind ideologies. Only philosophical thinking allows us to recognize that laws, values, and systems of governance must be constantly questioned. Does philosophy just reflect on the future, or does it shape it? Some argue that philosophy only analyzes the past and present, but the truth is that philosophy shapes the future. Philosophy predicts change before it happens. Nietzsche predicted the collapse of traditional values long before today's crisis of meaning and identity. Heidegger warned that technology would reshape human thought, and now artificial intelligence and virtual reality are redefining our perception of reality. Foucault showed that power constantly shifts forms, and today we see control not just in governments, but in data and digital networks. Philosophy does not just observe the future, it creates it. Philosophy is not just about understanding what has happened. Philosophy changes the course of history. When Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am," he wasn't just theorizing, he laid the foundation of modern thought. When Kant redefined freedom and ethics, he wasn't just writing a book, he influenced the development of human rights. When Simone de Beauvoir analyzed gender and power, she didn't just describe a problem, she sparked a revolution in thinking about equality. Philosophy doesn't just study the future, it shapes it. Where is philosophy going? What will the future of thought look like? If philosophy is always evolving, can we predict where it is heading? Philosophy as meta-philosophy. Perhaps in the future, philosophy will no longer be a separate field but a universal framework for thinking in all disciplines. Philosophy of science could become the foundation of all research. Philosophy of technology could guide the development of AI and digital ethics. Philosophy of politics could redefine governance and global cooperation. Philosophy as a tool for survival in a complex world. In a world where information overload and rapid change dominate, philosophy is what prevents us from getting lost. When fake news floods the world, philosophy teaches us how to identify truth. When ethical decisions become more difficult, philosophy gives us a framework for moral reasoning. When technology reshapes human identity, philosophy helps us understand what it means to be human. Conclusion of Part 6. Does philosophy still have a future? Philosophy defines the path of science, technology, and politics. Philosophy does not just analyze the past, it actively shapes the future. Philosophy is the only thing that can help us navigate a world that is constantly changing without losing our sense of meaning. In the final section, we will explore how philosophy can play a crucial role in personal thought and everyday life. Part 7. Philosophy in Personal Life and Individual Thought 1. Is philosophy only for philosophers? Many people think philosophy is complex and abstract, something meant only for universities and academic books. But in reality, philosophy is part of everyday life. Every time we think about the meaning of life, we are engaging in philosophical thought. Every time we discuss what is right or wrong, we are applying philosophy. Every time we ask ourselves what truly matters, we are stepping into the realm of philosophy. Philosophy is not just an academic subject. Philosophy is a way of life. How can philosophy transform personal life? Philosophy and conscious decision-making. Every day, we make countless decisions, from small choices like what to eat, to life-changing ones like switching careers or moving to a new place. But are we making these decisions consciously? Philosophy teaches us to make choices based on real values and deep thought. Philosophy saves us from blind conformity and following the majority without questioning. Philosophy helps us act with reason instead of reacting emotionally. Philosophy and protection against misinformation. We live in a world where information is endless and advertisements constantly target us. How can we distinguish truth from deception? Philosophy teaches critical thinking, the ability to analyze information rather than accepting it at face value. Philosophy helps us recognize which ideas are based on truth and which are just social conventions. Philosophy makes us more aware and independent thinkers. Philosophy and tolerance for uncertainty. Many people fear uncertainty and unanswered questions. But philosophy teaches us that uncertainty is a natural part of life. Philosophy helps us embrace questions rather than fear them. Philosophy teaches us not to expect absolute answers for everything. Philosophy enables us to find intellectual peace in a complex and unpredictable world. Philosophy and the search for meaning in life. Does life have meaning, or do we create it? Some philosophers like Camus and Sartre argue that life has no inherent meaning, but we can create our own. Others, like Plato and Kant, believe that meaning exists and must be discovered. Philosophy helps each person find their own way of understanding meaning, without blindly accepting predefined beliefs. Philosophy and inner fulfillment. In the modern world, many people feel empty and directionless despite material success. Why? Philosophy helps us understand where true fulfillment comes from. Philosophy shows that happiness is not just a goal, but a process and a mindset. Philosophy teaches us to look inward for meaning, rather than endlessly chasing external achievements. Philosophy in coping with suffering and death. Everyone will face loss, suffering, and death at some point. How should we deal with them? Philosophy provides mental preparedness to accept the impermanence of life. Philosophy teaches us that instead of escaping reality, we should embrace it and grow from it. 4. Can philosophy change the world, or just the individual? 4.1. Philosophy begins with individual transformation. Philosophy does not change the world directly, it changes individuals who go on to change the world. Every intellectual and cultural revolution in history began with individuals changing the way they think. 4.2. Philosophy as a path to mental freedom. Philosophy empowers us to think independently instead of blindly repeating what we are told. Philosophy frees the mind from the limitations of society, ideology, and propaganda. Philosophy gives us the freedom to choose our own path instead of living by predefined models. Conclusion: philosophy has no end, because thinking has no end. Philosophy is not something to be completed. It is a journey that continues as long as thinking exists. Philosophy is not just another academic field. It is the foundation of all knowledge and decision-making. Philosophy is not just for scholars. It is for anyone who wants to understand life and live more consciously. Philosophy, a journey that never ends, from FactUp. Since the beginning of history, philosophy has always been with us, not just as an academic discipline, but as a way to understand existence, humanity, and the future. In this video, we explored how philosophy is present in every aspect of life, science, technology, and decision-making. Many fields of knowledge may have branched out from philosophy, but philosophy remains alive, not as a collection of answers, but as the art of questioning. Philosophy has always been at the core of scientific, social, and personal progress. Philosophy is the only form of knowledge that grants us intellectual freedom. Philosophy is what protects us from ignorance, bias, and blind imitation. Maybe one day the name philosophy will change. Maybe in the future we will recognize it in a different form. But as long as humans continue to think, philosophy will exist. Not just as knowledge, but as the very essence of thought. To question, to doubt, and to seek truth, that is philosophy. And that is what keeps us truly alive. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this video. If you want to continue exploring deep ideas and perspectives with us, follow FactUp. Let's question more, think deeper, and stay aware together. Until the next video, stay philosophical.